Warm welcome again, and apologies, we are late, and technology has again been defying our logic. Again, a warm welcome to the Policy Forum. And just to go straight into the technicalities, because we are behind time, just to say that we were trying to broadcast on YouTube and Facebook. We've not really quite succeeded, but we are going to record this webinar, and we will make it available to watch afterwards via link. We are obviously not as many as we were expecting to with YouTube, but if you do have a question, do type it into the chat function on the side of the Zoom window. And when you do, could you mention your name and organization, as well as who the question is addressed to? We will be monitoring the questions, and if there are too many, we will try to kind of make sure that we can get as many questions answered as possible. Unfortunately, technical support and other clarifications, we will have to see how things go, because the setup has changed. So we'll try to support you as well as we can technically if you're having a problem. So without further ado, let me turn to Hannah, who will open the webinar finally. Well, Hannah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean, and thanks for the welcome. And I too would like to extend a warm welcome to everybody. Good morning to some, good afternoon and good evening to others. I'm thrilled to have been invited to moderate this session, and I'm really looking forward. The session, of course, which you all know, is titled Lessons Learned from the Coronavirus Pandemic, How to Build a More Resilient and Sustainable Future. And to help us discuss this, we have distinguished speakers. We have Magdalena Sepulveda and Richard Kozul-Wright, who will be giving a short presentation to start us off. But just before we do so, I think I'll just say 2 words about each of our speakers. I think many of you already know them, but even so, I thought it might be nice to know who's here. I should maybe add that I am Hannah Brejnholt, and I am with Oxfam EBIS in Denmark. I am also a member of the board of Eurodad. Right, so starting with Magdalena. Magdalena is a lawyer, and she has a PhD in international human rights law from Utrecht University in Netherlands, and she has an LLM in human rights law from the University of Essex in the UK. She was recently appointed the Executive Director of the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Before that, she was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. I think many of you remember that. Before that, she served as the UN Special, prior to that, she held the position Research Director at the International Council for Human Rights Policy in Geneva. She's also worked closely with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and from 2013 to 17, she was a member of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the United Nations Committee on Global Food Security. Magdalena is also a member of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRICT, where she obviously works with other well-known economists, social leaders on how to ensure fair fiscal policies to fight inequality. And last but not least, in 2015, she was recognized in the Global Tax 50, a list of individuals and organizations with the biggest impact on taxation worldwide. So quite some achievements there. Richard Kozul-Wright is the Director of Globalization and Development Strategies Division in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. He's worked at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and has published widely on economic issues, including in the Economic Journal, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Journal of Development Studies, and the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. He's also written a number of books, including Transforming Economies, Making Industrial Policy Work for Growth, Jobs and Development, The Resistible Rise of Market Fundamentalism, Rethinking Development Policy in an Unbalanced World. And he's edited volumes on transnational cooperation and the global economy, economic insecurity and development. securing peace, climate protection and development, and industrial policy. And more recently, Richard authored the report Financing a Global Green Deal, a Global Green New Deal, I should say, in which he argues for a coordinated global investment program to tackle the twin challenge of delivering social and economic development while stabilizing climate. So that's a short, and not quite fair intro of our speakers, but they've done lots, and I'm sure that they'll bring lots of insights into our discussion. And of course, then there is all the rest of you listening in. And as Jean said, do please type your questions and comments so we can have a lively debate. We're trying to keep this, brisk and bright and not too long. But let's get cracking. We're already a little behind time, so I'm going to go to Richard. The first round, we're going to have an introductory round where each of our speakers will have about 10 minutes to give them as our first comments. And then we'll have 2 rounds after that, during which we will comments and questions from people listening in. Right, so Richard, to kick us off, it's quite a broad question, the first one, around the COVID-19, of course. But what's your assessment or your view of the global response to the pandemic? And I'll try to limit our time. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to Eurodad and Jean for the invitation. The response to the crisis, I mean, obviously it's been an uneven response. I mean, at the national level, countries with different fiscal space, different financial capacity, different administrative capacities, and that's true within developed economies, but it's obviously true between developed and developing countries. And there's this huge unevenness. I mean, one of the things that interests us is the way in which some governments in the advanced countries, particularly those where governance has been privatized extensively, which is certainly true of the United States and the UK, have performed particularly badly. So unevenness obviously is the overriding feature. The mantra, however, has been very singular. I mean, the mantra has been, we will do whatever it takes to overcome this crisis, and we're not, and we're still in the relief and containment stages of the crisis. We're not even into the recovery stage of the crisis yet. But the kind of overwhelming mantra from policymakers and the politicians has been this idea of whatever it takes. We'll do whatever it takes to deal with this problem. And to some extent, countries have been doing that. What shocked us is the way that has not extended to the development agenda. And developing countries have been hit particularly hard by this crisis. It is a unique crisis. The nature of the shock is multiple. It's shocks on the demand side, shocks on the supply side, shocks through financial markets. And those very quickly had a very vicious impact on the economies in the South, often before the health crisis was hitting these economies. We know from the very huge outflows of capital from developing countries in the month of March and early April that this triggered a very vicious cycle in which we saw this outflow of capital. We saw currencies hit at the same time, depreciation of currencies. We saw bond spreads increasing. We saw foreign exchange being reduced significantly, tourist revenues down, remittances down. So this becomes a very vicious kind of cycle that hit developing countries very quickly. And we made an initial estimate based on the first few months of the crisis that we're looking at something like a $2 to $3 trillion hole in developing country finances over the next 15 to 24 months. And the IMF had a similar kind of number as well. And, this is pretty unprecedented, really. But the initial response to that, even once the IMF had put out this figure, was very lame, to put it mildly. And although there has been a reaction that has built slowly towards spring meetings in Washington in April. I mean, we kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek gave the international community a B- for its response in terms of its help to developing countries. And you know, if you go through all the necessary levers of support, special drawing rights to ensure sufficient liquidity in the global economy to keep things going, the debt relief and restructuring, long-term development finance, policy advice in terms of capital controls and other levers that would provide countries with the necessary protection. On all of these, the response has been very, very poor. I mean, the SDRs, where a lot of us, including ourselves, I have to say, did expect to see something coming out of the April meetings, largely because of US resistance. Nothing has so far happened on that. A lot of talk and some interesting ideas at least, but no actual tangible results. On the debt front, we had the suspension announced by the G20 countries. We had the IMF announcing a very small amount of debt relief for some of the poorest countries. But again, nothing in comparison to the scale of the problem, and no real talk of debt restructuring or debt cancellation. This is simply kicking the can down the road. Long-term finance, we have, you know, the IMF and the World Bank have announced new credit lines and have talked about making available all their various financial instruments available. But again, the numbers remain very weak. Lots of developing countries remain suspicious in terms of the likely conditionalities attached to some of these lending windows. So again, you know, weak response. And in terms of policy support, even though the IMF has been much more willing to contemplate capital controls over the course of the last 1 to 2 years, for example, no real serious discussion or encouragement of that by developing countries. WTO has done nothing, fundamentally a classic kind of bait and switch, warning about the restrictions on medical equipment and related health-related products, which is simply a segue into arguing for more liberalization, essentially. Worries about countries being taken to the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which is a serious concern for countries around issues of intellectual property. Again, no signals from the trading community that they're going to do anything other than really push for more liberalization as a solution to the kind of imbalances that we're seeing. So, I mean, it's been a very poor response, and I think it's important to understand that this is a response that's coming on top of a shaky global economy prior to COVID-19. The global economy was not in a good shape prior to January of this year. I mean, we, in our trade and development report, warned about the prospects of a global recession this year. We did not, needless to say, envisage something like COVID-19 causing that, but the imbalances that have built up since the 08-09 crisis have not been tackled. And you know, it's the slowest recovery on record. Austerity has been the default option when it comes to macroeconomic policy, other than using the monetary bazooka in some favored, that is available to some favored central banks, which itself is highly distortionary in terms of its impact. A lot of talk, of course, again, OECD and the Washington institutions about structural reform as the way to rebalance these economies, which is a code word for more liberalization, essentially, and a fundamental failure, a systematic failure to address the underlying inequalities, which themselves were a major factor in the run-up to the crisis of 2008 and 2009. You know, so I mean, and to some extent, I think COVID-19 has done a lot to expose those failures of the post 08-09 response by the advanced economies, and that's a good thing at a certain level. But it's a very troubled state of affairs when it comes to thinking through the medium-term and longer-term impact of this crisis, not only on developing countries where we are particularly worried, but also on on the advanced economies too. So it's a fairly bleak and worrying picture, even though, you know, I mean, Georgieva has made, you know, some positive noises, I think, as a head of the IMF. I think it would be unfair not to acknowledge that they have made some important statements. But in terms of practice, I think it is a very long way from what is required, given the seriousness of the shocks that are hitting developing countries particularly.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this analysis and rather bleak. People will hasten on and carry on, and I'll ask you a couple of questions, Magdalena. So turning to look at more of the country level, which countries, in your opinion, have been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic? And also, which obstacles are they facing dealing with both the pandemic, but also as we look forward at the recovery? So basically picking up maybe where Richard left off.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Jen, for the invitation to participate at this meeting. I think that if we look at the number of deaths, the disease has hit certain countries with particularly cruelty. We have Brazil, the UK, Spain, Italy, USA, Mexico. But what I think that is important to stress is that several of these countries has been implementing similar type of measures. So we have austerity measures, as Richard was mentioning, and privatization. We have long-standing discrimination of ethnic and racial minorities, disabled people and migrants in several of these countries. And we have a structural gender discrimination. And I think that this has created the perfect storm of human rights violation among marginalized group of people. So I would say that instead of asking which are the countries that have been hit the most, we have to ask ourselves what are the groups in the global north and in the global south that have been hit the most, because there are very similar groups around the globe. So we have women, we have been hit disproportionately. Migrant workers, where they are in the UK or in the Gulf countries, they've been exposed and the most and disproportionately impacted. Of course, informal workers, where in Mexico or in Brazil, informal worker has been hit the hardest. And I think that overall, those who were living in poverty and just above the poverty line, those people that were living in so precarious life, with so little social protection and safety net, that they were just one crisis above falling into poverty. So those are the groups around the world that have been hitting the hardest. I would like to focus particularly on women. And I would like to give the example of my own region in Latin America. Women here in Latin America are at the frontline responders of the crisis. 72% of all people employed in the health sector in Latin America are women. However, due to occupational segregation, they are overrepresented in the low level of the healthcare respondents. So there are the nurses, the community volunteers, the social workers, those who are already in precarious working conditions, low salaries, little protection and little security in their work. So they've been also exposed to get COVID. Also, due to the confinement measures, the women's security are also being threatened. We have been seeing all around the world how domestic violence or violence against women has increased. The amount of time that women are alone with their abusers while reducing their possibilities for seeking help have put them really in a very threatening situation. And this is also compound with the austerity measures, because in many countries, austerity measures actually cut the money available for survivors of domestic violence and for having an alternative to go, some protection houses, etc. And then what is also very important is that the pandemic has made evident the unjust social organization of care and how insufficient have been around the globe the measures to recognize, reduce, and redistribute and care and domestic work. So what are the challenges? The challenges are enormous. So if we look at, particularly in the case of Latin America, to give a very concrete example, we are facing now that many of the important measures that women have achieved in recent decades, such as the increased access to the labor force, can be reversed. So women are concentrated in Latin America in social services, in the formal work is social services, retail sales, transportation, and communication. These four sectors account for 78% of all employed women in the region. So, and these sectors are probably going to be hit the hardest, and many of those positions, many of those work are going to be lost. So, and also again, women are overrepresented in the small business and also in informal workers. So again, women are really hit the hardest. We also have in the region an increased precarious working conditions for domestic workers. More than 18 million domestic workers are in the region, and they have been completely abandoned by their former employers and by the states. So they were already in very precarious working conditions, and now they're completely abandoned. And as I said before, the confinement and the quarantine measures have deepened the crisis of care in the region. Before the health crisis, women from Latin America dedicated a third of their time to domestic and unpaid care work. But the limited and unequal access to health system now have put more burden on women. Women are those who are taking care in the health services, but also at home. The closure of school linked to the patriarchal family relationships in the region also imply that women are doing the education and teaching at the home and doing all the other domestic care work. And it has also, I have to add this, reverse the feminist mobilization. I have to remind all of you that March, when the crisis or the COVID has not hit yet this side of the Atlantic, there were massive feminist mobilization led by Argentina, but we saw that in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, etc. And now, because of all the restriction, again, women are put at the back. So the situation, it's very bleak, as Richard said. And I think that one has to look at it from the specific groups that have been hit the hardest. And it's going to be tough to sort of prevent more damage. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, and thank you for pointing out that we should probably be looking at groups rather than individual specific countries. So picking up on some of Magdalena's points, Richard, now we're going into this first round of actual debate, so we'll start bringing in questions after your interventions here. But the pandemic has put the Leave No One Behind slogan from the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, further out of reach. Inequalities have been deepened, and especially around gender inequalities, which Magdalena just pointed out. So how likely do you think is that we get back on track to achieve the SDGs? And is there a way in which we can tackle inequality once and for all?
That's a big question. I think we should start partly by, I don't like the framing of the inequality challenge as one of people being left behind. People are not, we live in a very interdependent world. No one is left. Lots of people are thrown under the bus in this world, but being thrown under a bus is very different from being left behind. You know, left behind is a kind of Home Alone kind of metaphor where you've somehow your parents have gone off and they've forgotten about you, or the bus has pulled away and they've left you in the station. That's not what's going on in terms of the way in which inequality is structured and reproduced in this world. There are a set of rules of the game that rig the outcomes in favor of some groups and sectors of the economy and against other groups and sectors. And that's the way in which the rules are designed. It's not an accident. Squeezing costs down at the bottom of the pyramid is how those at the top of the pyramid earn their extensive incomes and rents. So I just don't think I think we need to stop talking about people being left behind and talking about the way in which those rules are rigged. And it's something that we've done in the work in UNCTAD in terms of our understanding of this hyper-globalized world that has emerged out of this combination of forces that have been mobilized since the late 1970s, early 1980s around the marketization, financialization, and the concentration of economic activity. And we've tried to show that these kinds of forces that have been that are the product of policy design and political action. They're not kind of products of technology or nature, but they are designed as such. You know, are the reasons why inequality has been so high in this period, this last 30-year period of hyperglobalization? Why, as a consequence, indebtedness is a necessary way in which the system operates, in which the system is to some extent held together, although it's also a source, it's also both a glue and a solvent, because indebtedness leads to incredible tensions that produce very significant downside risks. Why insecurity, why the things that Magdalena talked about the rise of a precarious economy and high levels of insecurity are a necessary part of that, of those rules and structures. And the great irony, and it comes back in a way to the question that you began about the SDGs, the great irony of this set of rules of the game is that even though it's sold as being kind of business friendly, I mean, you know, the entrepreneur is the great kind of idol of this way in which people kind of present the benefits of this system. This system has been very bad for investment. That is, levels of investment, both private and public, have been very weak under this set of rules of the game. And that's partly, of course, because the large profits that the system has generated have not gone into reinvesting it in skills and equipment and plant and factories, but in financial assets, of course. And that's something that perpetuates these high levels of inequality and insecurity. But it's not being good for physical or productive investment. And whatever else you can say about the SDGs, I mean, one thing it is at least is implied by it, is it's the biggest kind of investment push in modern history. I mean, you can't deliver any of these goals without a huge investment in the real economy. And one of the great tragedies for us is that, and when we look at a lot of the discussion of the SDGs, is that, you know, too much of the discourse has been about trying to entice those at the top who have benefited from these rigged rules, and rules that themselves are a source of the problems of the SDGs. They're a source of instability, they're a source of inequality and exclusion. But, you know, the mantra is how we get these private financiers and financial corporations to invest in public goods. And if anybody, I mean, first of all, they're not investing in private goods, at least good private goods. So the idea that somehow they're suddenly going to switch and start investing in healthcare and education is a myth, except in small pockets of that have very large sources of rents and returns. You know, so, I mean, I guess we are worried that, having seen the SDGs fall behind before COVID-19, which is the case. I mean, we did work in the Trade and Development Report that showed that even just taking the first 4 SDGs of poverty, nutrition, health, and education, there was just simply no way that most developing countries, given the structure of the economies that they face, could deliver on these without either acquiring hugely unsustainable debts or growing at double-digit growth rates, neither of which are likely under the current circumstances. So unless we do see not simply an incremental change, and certainly not a further round of discussions about public-private partnerships and corporate social responsibility, all of which are possible coming out of this crisis. But unless we break with that kind of thinking, I think the SDGs are simply dead in the water.
Right. So in that case, well, I think we'll move away from the SDGs a bit. I can see you, Magdalena, also kind of like wanting to answer here. And one of the things I would that I wanted us to so there's the pandemic has exposed the painful links between years of austerity and also sort of weak systems in the public sector, and especially around health systems. And I wonder if there, in your opinion, if there are some lessons to learn from this as we move forward. And then I wanted to pick up afterwards, Richard, on some of your what's the solution then. But Magdalena, I'll pass over to you first. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I think that we have to be reminded that austerity measures were the old normal pre-crisis, pre-COVID crisis. So, and this was happening around the world. I mean, it was very clear after the economic crisis, the measures that were taken in Europe, but it wasn't only Europe, it was elsewhere around the globe. So, and the austerity measures taken had a direct link on the devastating impact of COVID crisis, because there were cuts in pensions and social security reforms that limited access to social protection, cutting the public sector wage bill, including the numbers and the salaries of teachers and health workers, those who need the most at this moment, and also cutting the salaries of civil servants delivering public services. And this, again, I have to stress, had an enormous impact on women. Many of the austerity measures were possible because women were taking through unpaid care and domestic work the tasks that were not longer funded, meaning from taking care of young children to taking care of unable adults, etc. So, and also women are overrepresented among the public sector. So when you cut public sector salaries, or when you reduce the number of public sector workers, you are hitting the hardest women. There was also further targeting to social assistance or welfare measures. Universal credit in the UK was a horrible measures, and that is very linked to the high number of deaths that we're seeing in the UK today. There was also an increased regression in taxation, with an emphasis on consumption taxes such as VAT, again, that hit harder the poorest and women because of their consumption patterns. There was a strengthening of public-private partnerships, and we all know the negative impact of that. And of course, very severe healthcare reforms that cut the money invested in that. So the spread of COVID-19 exposes catastrophic consequence of fiscal construction pursued aggressively over the last decades. So what are the lessons to learn regarding the health system? I think that there are many. And I think that an important one is actually, and for me it's very important as a human rights advocate, that we need to put again an emphasis of health as a human right, and the provision of health care as a way to fulfill the right to health that people have. And this is very important. And if we look experiences in the past, somehow when we confronted the HIV/AIDS crisis and we put an emphasis on access to health as a right, the world was in a much better position to address the crisis and address the stigma, discrimination, and ensure access to retroviral to everyone. So that is very important. Another important issue that it's not always discussed is actually the link between healthcare and democracy. Because now we have seen a lot of infringement on civil rights through, for example, the surveillance methods or the tracking methods that have been done in several countries under the excuse of public health. But it's not only that, it's not only our restrictions in terms of tracking and privacy and data protection. We have also seen around the world that there's been lack of accountability of government regarding discussion related to access to tests and care or redistribution of the necessary mechanisms to machinery, health machinery to get out of the or to survive when you're very sick. We have also seen limitation in sexual and reproductive rights around the world, using COVID as an excuse, and again also working conditions for health providers. So what are the challenge and what we can sort of the opportunities to move forward is just, again, as I said, putting an emphasis on health as a right and access to health care as a way to fulfill those rights and the correlative obligation for states. And also to look at things that we are not looking at, so sort of the links between democracy and health. But and finally, and it's very important, but I think that most citizens around the world are realizing this, the way in which public services, in particular public health care, it's essential, and we are linked. So what has happened to my poor neighbor, it also can affect me. So it is important to look at it in this solidarity point of view.
Thank you very much. So I did say, Richard, I wanted to ask you around what is the way forward in financing health and other public goods, but I also see there's a number of questions, so maybe we can sort of take some of them. So some of these questions are coming in from all our colleagues listening in. The first one is from Lars Koch from Action Aid Denmark. He says, what are the opportunities for releasing the SDRs if the US resists, or can they be convinced? Is there an issue we can advocate for in other countries, or is it a dead end? I think this one is for you, Richard. And then Emma Bugiza from Bretton Woods says, the IMF has said they are expecting to start approving new long-term loan programs this summer. What do the panelists think would be realistic to ask of them to change, to build back better in that time frame, given Georgieva's positive language on this? And then there's a specific question for Magdalena from Gunil Axelsson from Nusanda, I'm not quite sure. The question is, this time the lack of social protection is a reason for why the economic crisis becomes a humanitarian crisis. Therefore, austerity cannot be the way out of the crisis. Do you think that this kind of argument is possible to get broad support for, or will this support only be from the leftists? And then there's one final question. This one is for you, Richard, from Henrik Wahl from Slug in Norway. He says, what role do you see for UNCTAD in driving forward discussion amongst member states on real solutions to the ongoing and coming debt problems? So I think, Richard, would you like to start? And then Magdalena, you can take over afterwards.
Sure. On the SDR, I mean, there is an obvious problem with the SDRs, which is that they're linked to the quota of members, and those quotas are very heavily biased in favor of the advanced economies. So there's always an argument that if you simply ask for a new allocation of SDRs, it won't go to the people that need, or the countries that need them. And that's the argument to some extent that Mnuchin made although when he resisted and there was a lot of I mean, there's been a, you know, there has been a lot of momentum for FDRs coming from a lot of countries, not just the South, but in the advanced economies too. And to some extent that's clear. I mean, that problem needs to be addressed of allocation. And indeed, Mnuchin has talked separately of being willing to discuss that issue separately from the question of a new allocation. We need to talk about both together, given the scale of the potential liquidity constraint that countries are facing. So, I mean, you know, a lot of people on the other say that essentially this was much more political on the American side, that they didn't want countries like Venezuela and Iran to have access to SDRs, and that was far more important than the actual mechanics of a new SDR allocation. So, I think the pressure. I do think that the pressure is still on for an SDR allocation. I think the discussion will have to address the issue of how SDRs are allocated. Behind the discussion, of course, is a much more difficult political economy issue of the role of the dollar as the center of the current international financial system. You know, at some point we're going to have to address this issue. That gives the one country a tremendous amount of power over the way in which the international financial system works. And I think there's an increasing recognition that that is a power that is very easy to abuse and does not really produce the kind of balanced system that we need when addressing the kinds of problems that we're talking about. But that's, I mean, that brings in a whole slew of very complicated political economy questions. But I do think there's going to be more of a conversation about that moving out of COVID-19 than was true before. I mean, and we know it from the debt issue. You know, the amount of debt that is issued in dollars is just, you know, I think it's something like 40 or 50% of developing country debt is issued in dollars. Even some advanced economies, the debt is dollar denominated. So it's a real source of economic and political power that does distort the operations of a balanced financial system that we're going to have to address. In terms of the, I mean, you know, we at least we are still waiting to see whether the IMF, in terms of new lending windows, longer-term lending windows, will continue to pursue the kind of conditionalities that, at least for us, have distorted much of the lending landscape over the last 30 or 40 years, and of course has made many developing countries very wary about going to borrow from the IMF, and has forced them into, you know, borrowing from the private sector, which has its own problems, of course, you know, especially when it comes to long-term lending. I mean, there are some encouraging signs there. The IMF is under pressure to some extent from new lenders from the South, the new emerging banks in China, the new development bank, and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that tend to be less concerned with policy conditionalities than the IMF, although the scale as yet is perhaps not as great as it needs to be. But I mean, there are some encouraging signs there that there is countervailing pressure on the IMF. But I think it's imperative that the civil society continues to closely examine the kinds of conditionalities that are being attached to any sort of new lending programs, to see if there has been the kind of change that, I mean, to some extent, Lagarde signaled changes as well, and not very much happened, if the truth be known. So I mean, we welcome Georgieva's words, but whether that translates into practice is a long-standing issue. UNCTAD, that's a long question about what UNCTAD can do. Maybe that will come back in other questions. That's a long and sorry story, but all I can say is that the COVID-19 crisis has at least reminded people that we are there offering a different set of policy options around the debt issue, than has come out from the traditional players. You know, the advanced economies have spent the last 40 years trying to block UNCTAD in this area. And they will continue to do so. In the end of the day, it's about whether developing countries will give UNCTAD the necessary political and financial ammunition to be able to take the kind of work that we do and make it a more visible and actionable part of the international policy agenda.
Thank you, Richard. So I'll pass it over to you, Magdalena. There was, if you'd like to answer the question around IMF, you're most welcome to do so too. And then there was one specifically to you around social protection.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to stress what Richard said. I think that if the IMF and the World Bank do not depart from the dogmas of austerity, we will be in a worse situation than we are now. And there are some signs that there is still calling for a structural reform in their COVID-related lending assistance program. So I'm a little bit worried. It's true that sometimes the rhetoric is different of what they're doing in practice, but they have to sort of fill that gap. In terms of social protection, I thank you for the question. I think that this is critical. I think that social protection, increasing the coverage and making very substantive social protection programs around the world, contributory and non-contributory, in particular non-contributory in developing countries, and improving the contributory system, in particular to recognize the reproductive role of women, for example, in the contributory system, will be a major step forward. And there are very good signs in this. I mean, around the world, we have seen that the coverage of social protection, in particular non-contributory programs, have expanded. A very good case that you have there in Europe, in Spain, that have called for universal basic income. It's very good, but we're also seeing in other parts of the world. In Latin America, there has been an increase in social protection programs. Several countries around the world have announced to increase their non-contributory program, and that is very useful. So it seems that there is an opportunity now. I mean, we have been working to pushing for an increase in social protection coverage from around the world for many years. Organizations like the ILO have been working hard on this. There is an opportunity now, and I think that there is an opportunity of imagination in a way. It is possible. We have seen that countries can extend their coverage quite quickly. They can move to universal basic income. It is possible. So let's keep on pushing to make it a reality. If I look at Latin America, what happened was that, for example, when the economic crisis hit in 2008, there were many countries which took counter-cyclical measures and expanded their social protection programs. That was a very significant sign. But by 2010, they took it back and started sort of furthering targeting and reducing the program. So there is an opportunity. We have to seize that opportunity for more redistributional policies and more social protection, but this is not taken for granted. So I don't know, we have to remain hopeful, and there is some hope. We know that social protection measures can be the way forward, but it required us, it required civil society, it required academic to keep on pushing and calling for the need of social protection.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. There are a bunch more questions. I just wanted to check out, because we were a little late starting, so I was wondering if we can go over time, and if, especially Richard, Magdalena, if you are here, it's technically possible, if you have time to stay on for a little bit. Yeah, excellent. Thanks a lot. Then we move for more questions. So let me find them here in the chat. Oh, so there was some. Let's see. So the first one on financialization and financial architecture. There's one from Magdalena here from May Bateman. She's asking, the need to invest in the real economy and not just financial assets is almost totally accepted for many, many years now, well beyond just those who actively oppose privatization, private finance, etc. And yet it just doesn't seem to be sinking in with the larger NGOs / large development actors. How can we overcome this? And let me see. Maybe we'll have this one first, and then there's one for Richard afterwards. And then I had a few more questions as well, but I think maybe we're sort of going into the second round, and some of the students. So I'll let you go first, Magdalena, and then we'll switch.
I think that's the opportunity that we have in way of moving forward is it's really to have a cross-sectoral movement and to build collective power. So this is my way to answer to what happened with NGOs and the big development organization. We have to start working together. I think that for me, this is the only way forward. And we need to understand that in order to tackle the systemic injustices that we have seen pre-crisis, sort of the free market fundamentalism, patriarchy, corporate capture, institutionalized racism, discrimination, we all need to work together. So, and this is, I think that NGOs should, all type of different NGOs, those who work for development, those who work for human rights, those who work for tax justice, need to start, a feminist organization need to start making stronger coalitions and working together with all the different sort of interdisciplinary approaches to tackle this structural injustice as the way to move forward.
Thanks, Magdalena. And then I'll turn to the question for you, Richard. This is from Nicola from Observatorio de la Deuda en la Globalización. My Spanish is not great, sorry. What would be the strategy to make financial actors invest in the real economy and not the financial economy? What would be the way to fight financialization? However, if we promote private finance actors to invest in SDG projects, don't we fuel financialization of basic goods and services? Yeah, well, I think we'll stop there for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, I mean, the basic premise on which we begin our understanding is that when it comes to delivering, you know, classic public goods, then it has to be done by a properly financed public sector. And, you know, making sure that the public sector is not constantly undermined both through austerity and the whole array of abusive fiscal practices that high wealth individuals and corporations engage in is a necessary condition for being able to meet the SDGs. That doesn't exclude a role for private investment, in my opinion. You know, in that sense, I do adopt a fairly classic Keynesian position in which private investment can be crowded into various sectors of the economy. But it has to be done, the direction has to be very clearly set by public policy and effective public regulation, as well as public investment. And all those three elements of what I would consider to be a kind of balanced economy have essentially been hollowed out over the course of the last 3 decades. So you know, we need to get back to a progressive taxation system in which those at the top do not pay less than those at the bottom, which is the case now. We need to regulate massively. Private finance has to be hugely regulated. We can have an argument about what forms of regulation, to what extent public banks or nationalized banking systems of one kind or another can be used in that process. But public banks have a very, you know, and here the IMF and the World Bank played a very destructive role by essentially dismissing public banks as a necessary vehicle of financing, or at least ignoring them and not giving them the kind of credit that is needed, and encouraging them and supporting them as well. So I mean, public banking has to be brought, I think, back into the fray. So you know, I think that I don't think you can have a balanced economy at the global or the national levels if you have a world dominated by footloose capital. That's just my reading of history of the 20th and the 21st century. So it's imperative that we rein in footloose capital and the multiple predatory kind of practices that tend to go once foot capital is allowed to move where it wants, when it wants, how it wants, and to, in the process, which is what has happened in this period, to dictate economic policy. You know, the groups in this in the economy that like austerity is footloose capital. I mean, it's not simply an ideological choice. I mean, there's a lot of economic power behind the decision to rebalance through austerity measures, and unless you really do tackle those imbalances in economic and political power, it's very difficult, I think, to envisage a way of delivering on the various goals that we've set ourselves, whether that's under the SDGs or other framework. So I think that, I think that's understanding the mechanisms that finance use to be able to reproduce this highly unequal and unsustainable world, I think is imperative, you know, for international civil servants as it is for civil society and NGOs. I think a lot of civil society have a slightly naive view of finance, and that somehow if we're nice to them and give them more incentives, that somehow they'll do the right thing. And I just don't think there's very little evidence to support that kind of thinking, actually.
Right, everyone to the barricades. So thanks, Richard. So we'll get our act together. There are lots more questions, and happily some of the questions are sort of matched up the ones that I was going to ask in the second round. I'm going to start with one for Magdalena. It is from Isabelle from ActionAid. She says, can we imagine a positive scenario for the next few months, things we could realistically win as the current crisis would generate opportunities that weren't there before? So I was going to ask you to talk a bit about the opportunities, whether this is a make or break moment. And then I'm going to get back to you, Richard, with a question. Magdalena.
I have to confess that I personally move from hope to despair and from optimism to pessimism about what we can achieve. So maybe that is going to be reflected in my response. So it depends on the day that I'm more optimistic or pessimistic. But I do think that there are some opportunities. As I said before, we have seen that some states have taken measures that would have been impossible just a few months ago. We have seen governments nationalizing health systems, providing direct cash payments, sort of increasing coverage of non-contributory social protection, suspending evictions and foreclosures. So I think that there is some measures. These provide us that we can rethink our economic and governance models in a different way. I also think that another important opportunity is that citizens are now more aware of the need to have strong public services and healthcare and education. In a way, they are more convinced that we desperately need to change course of action. And I think that this gives us an opportunity. So oftentimes, civil society organizations or academics or international organizations, there is a big gap in what they're trying to achieve and what the common citizen think it is their priority is an important thing. And I think that at this very moment, we are at the same level. So our messages for stronger public services, for regulating the private sector, for having progressive taxation system, for increased coverage of social protection, it is in line of what people are, the common citizens around the world are feeling as the important next step. So we do have an opportunity, but of course the risks are the fact that the elites and those who benefit from the status quo, those vested interests, can win this battle. So I don't know, it depends on the day for Isabel who asked the question, but I think that there's a lot for us as civil society to do to push forward, and it's the right time for doing it.
Thanks, Magdalena. So little optimism, maybe. Richard, I'm going to turn to you. There's a couple of questions.
I think Hannah has frozen. Hannah? I think that Hannah is frozen, but maybe Cecilia, can you read out some of the questions that there are?
I mean, can I just come back on, I mean, just...
Yeah, go ahead.
On the last one, because I agree, I mean, I do agree with Magdalena. I mean, you know, I think there are a lot of opportunities coming out of the crisis too, that we need to, you know, just the language, you know, the recognition that resilience now has to frame a lot of the discussion. The need to recover better. I mean, the danger is that these will be co-opted by the neoliberal orthodoxy. That's a danger, but they also do offer opportunities, I think, to frame a different type of narrative too. And I think it's incredibly important that all progressive forces, wherever they happen to be, kind of do, you know, have a strong counter narrative that can use what is, you know, the notion of anxiety is probably the single greatest characteristic of most people and communities in this day and age. It was before COVID-19. It certainly is now. And to be able to speak to those anxieties and to kind of frame an alternative, I do think provides a lot of opportunities for a more progressive and international agenda to emerge out of the COVID-19. I just think we just have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, the powers that be will not kind of go down lightly. They won't be rolling over and, you know, putting their legs in the air and hoping someone will come and tickle them. That's not how these people will respond to this crisis. So, but there are, people have a sense that, I mean, and we saw it in a very visceral way with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, all of a sudden, what had been a series of intermittent kind of concerns have suddenly galvanized into a very powerful narrative and demonstrations of, countervailing power, essentially. And so, you know, I think it's being able to tap into those sentiments and feelings and provide the sense that there are genuine alternatives, which is kind of critical at this moment.
Anna, I just took over quickly, but go ahead. You were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many of the questions were asked. And unfortunately, I have lost the questions that were in the chat before. But one of the ones I think was Cecilia may just be placing it in again. I think it will overlap with the impact of the crisis and the need to address climate change. Talking more about one of your issue areas around the global Green Deal, whether that might be a roadmap as we're looking forward. I don't know, Cecilia, did you manage to paste the other one? Or else maybe you can start talking at this point and then I'll just get back to you in a moment, Richard, with more details of the questions that were
Yeah, on the global, well, obviously you're putting me in a kind of salesperson mode here because we've been pushing the global Green New Deal.
I thought you might like it.
As an alternative narrative, of course. And I mean, it's an interesting one I mean, it's not a new one at least for me. I mean, and out of the 08-09 crisis, was when the original discussions of a Green New Deal first emerged as a way of both dealing with the economic shock and the short-term recovery, and what was then clearly seen as the need for a transformative shift to some kind of low carbon growth path. And when I was in the UN in New York at the time of Copenhagen, we talked about a global Green New Deal and in fact I did a report for UN DESA that argued for a global Green New Deal. I mean, it died a death partly for the reasons that Magdalena talked about, that you can't do a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal on the back of austerity macroeconomics. That's the two work in very different directions. And once austerity became the default in the advanced economies, that idea, that expectation to some extent that there was an alternative that could combine recovery with a transformative shift just kind of died. So we have been here before. I mean, I guess I'm more encouraged this time around than a decade ago, in the sense that there seems to be more of a momentum, and I think partly because the Green New Deal, as it's been fashioned in the advanced economies, has been much more tightly linked to notions of economic justice than was probably true in 2008, 2009. And that notion of economic justice extends, at least in the way we think about that in an organization like UNCTAD, to addressing imbalances in the structure of the global economy and the economic injustices that come from that. So I think there is a lot of positive movement, I think, in that direction of thinking how we combine recovery, resilience, and transformation around this notion of a global Green New Deal. From a policy point of view, there's nothing really tremendously innovative in the Green New Deal. It's whoever's talking about it basically has the same elements, right? It has to be expansionary. It can't, as I said, it can't be done on the back of austerity. So you're talking about an expansionary macroeconomic, monetary, and fiscal framework around which a Green New Deal can be constructed. A very strong component for public investment in terms both of mitigating and adapting to the climate challenge, and shifting to not only new patterns of energy production, but new sources of agricultural production, new forms of public transportation, etc. I think that can only be driven by a very large and significant public investment drive. You have to have a progressive taxation system, and that's part of most Green New Deals. You have to control finance for the reasons I said, and talk about both the need for strong public banking and a much more activist central bank that is not simply fixated with inflation targeting, because to some extent that's the monetary side of the austerity agenda. So it's going to have to require central banks to start behaving in a different way. And interestingly, they've begun to talk if you listen to someone like Mark Carney, I mean, they do talk a somewhat different language than they were doing in 2008, 2009. And you have to talk as a final element, I think, in this, about both industrial policy, because I don't think you can make this kind of transformation. I mean, as I said, this is not this is not about simply excluding the private sector or private investment from this agenda. I don't think it is, but you need industrial policy if you're going to move in this direction, you know, and sotto voce, you're going to have to talk about planning too, you know, which has been a dirty word for a long time in the economic lexicon. I know that. But I mean, again, all these all these things have in a way come back with COVID-19. Every single one of those components has often in slightly bizarre and certainly unexpected ways and from unexpected sources come back into the discussion. Every single one of those is now back in the discussion. And so the worry is, of course, that once the crisis somehow eases off, then there will be a significant pushback on all those fronts, which I would expect to see too. And I think people need to be prepared for that, both at the national and at the international level. But you know, that I think the Green New Deal and the Global Green New Deal provide a narrative to unite, to bring those features together into a coherent framework that can address you know, a whole slew of anxieties that are worrying people both in the north and in the south. I think the big challenge for us is that the multilateral system as it's currently constituted is not fit for purpose in terms of backstopping that kind of agenda. So and you cannot solve the problem of climate or indeed inequality unless you have an international agenda. It can't be done nation state by nation state, although the policies themselves will be implemented at the national level. You can't do that nation state by nation state. You need some sort of international framework to be able to undertake this kind of these kinds of actions. And I guess that's a big worry for us, because we don't believe that the current multilateral system really is fit for purpose, and it's going to have to be both reform of existing institutions and the addition of new institutions, I think, if we're really going to move at the kind of pace that we're certainly on the environment front, the kind of pace we need to be able to you know, build a better future.
Thanks, Richard. I think I'm going to pick a few questions now, and they're sort of going to be coming towards the last ones. So there are a few different ones going, and basically for both of you. So I think that we'll start sort of making this also your concluding remarks, so then I'll hand over, but just so that we can start rounding off, so we don't have people here all night, although I'm sure we would love to discuss this for ages, but we do have the next couple of days too, some of us at least. There's one question here from Bodo Elmers. He's asking whether you would be aware of any good practice in the use of the $9 trillion to reduce inequality. And then we have Dariana, who is asking, would you be optimistic about the rising role cooperation and common action on the level of the regional integration entities such as the African Union and globally by the BRICS, despite the present political leadership of the respective countries? And there was one more I just wanted to, let's see. Yeah, there's one here that says, as civil society organizations, COVID-19 outbreak is an opportunity for us to put our civil society issues high on the agenda. After this pandemic, according to you, which will be the next challenge that development cooperation / ODA could contribute to fight against or shape that agenda? Would it be climate change, digitalization, etc.? And then a final one for Richard, which is on debt. What way forward is from Tia Fjordos and from Norway, also from Debt Justice Norway. What way forward do you see for the debt resolution mechanism within the UN system? How do you assess the level of political will at this point? And then we have, and there's maybe one more, although IIB, CDP and other China-dominated new banks seem to put IMF under pressure. China is just repeating the whole system learned and played by traditional lenders. Richard, do you have another view on Chinese stakeholders? So some of them were directed to you, Richard, and some more broad. So Magdalena, them. But maybe also I can ask you to make this your concluding remarks that we can take with us, and maybe give us a few hints of where we might look and what kind of things we should be discussing and over the next couple of days for our policy forum, and where you think, where can we make a difference, what should we be looking out for, what shouldn't we be doing. Yeah, so I'm going to pass on to you first, Richard, and Magdalena, then afterwards you can pick on the ones you would like. Thanks.
Okay, and let me try and do that, and also by way of a wrap up, as I understand correctly, the rules of the game.
That would be terrific, thanks.
I mean, you know, I think obviously we're still trying to work out what, in response to Bodo's question, just exactly what is in these packages and how they are working. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of confusion about what you know, when you see these huge numbers, 9 trillion, 10 trillion, 12 trillion, I mean, what is actually involved? Because a huge amount of this, of course, is credit lines and credit guarantees, and certainly not government spending. Although, you know, the encouraging parts are the government spending parts of it so far. I mean, you know, there is a move towards kind of basic income type thinking in some of these, not on the kind of scale that we would like to see, or with the real clarity that I think is necessary if basic income is to be a useful part of any sort of alternative strategy moving forward. And I mean, I'm not a basic income person, but I do think there is a role. It has a potential role in a wider package, and that's been put out there as a consequence of what has happened. Obviously, there is commitment to strengthening health systems. The care economy has become much more visible as a consequence of what's been happening, and that's got to be a positive thing. Again, you know, when Boris Johnson becomes a supporter of the national health system, you should be asking very serious questions about what that means, given the role of the Tory government over the previous 10 years, including himself. But the fact is that the care economy has been put out there as part of a serious discussion that needs to be had about a more resilient future. And to some extent, I think, you know, in a perverse way, the use of subsidies to keep sectors of the economy going, although we can argue again about, you know, whether we would want to keep the cruise industry sector going or not. I mean, there's serious questions to be asked there. But for developing countries, you know, that blows away a lot of arguments that have been taking place in the WTO about just how awful subsidies are as part of a coherent industrial policy, which developing countries have been arguing for the last 30 years, and the WTO has been pushing against. So you take these as being kind of positive. So I don't think on anything close to the scale that is needed, but I take those as being positive. In terms of, you know, what's coming down, I mean, you know, I mean, I guess it's maybe pleasing words for this audience, but debt is going to be the big political issue coming out of this crisis. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt. And it's not just country level debt, it's going to be, you know, corporate debt, it's going to be household debt. I mean, debt is going to be the big challenge. And, you know, we know from past experience that can turn very reactionary very quickly, and you know, it's going to require a lot of pressure from civil society and from more progressive governments to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past when it comes to handling debt problems and the problem of debt overhangs. You know, UNCTAD's long-standing call for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which we've always maintained is a significant hole in the multilateral architecture that continues to hamper the search for fair and swift solutions to debt problems in developing countries, is kind of, I mean, we're pushing it, and it's part of the conversation. It's a bit more visible in the conversation than it was 5 months, 6 months ago. That's clearly true. It doesn't have the kind of momentum that we would hope, you know, coming out of this crisis, because I don't think any of the solutions coming of a more kind of creditor-friendly nature are going to get us anywhere close to solving the kind of debt problem that is inherited as a consequence of COVID-19. But debt will be the I think the single biggest issue politically that comes out of this crisis, and we need to make sure that there's a progressive response to that. I think China's a complicated story. I don't really want to go there, other than to be increasingly frustrated at the kind of yellow peril colonial mentality that is now coloring that debate. And it's not just a Trump phenomena. You see it all across Europe. And at a time when multilateralism needs to be strengthened, this is probably the single biggest issue that is making multilateralism ironically weaker and weaker and weaker, particularly from those in Europe who claim to be the great upholders of the multilateral tradition. So that will be critical for us in terms, which is not to say that China does everything right, that's clearly not the case, but that kind of relentless and often kind of bizarre, when British foreign ministers get on their high horse about Hong Kong, you know that you've fallen down the rabbit hole a very, very long way. And I think the sooner Western powers come to terms with the fact that they're not ruling the world as much as they were, then the better the chances of building a kind of multilateralism that can genuinely find solutions to the problems that we've been talking about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks for this. Magdalena, I'm going to turn over you for comments, or both on the questions, but also if you have any concluding remarks, and then you're free to take it in the direction you would like to. So go ahead.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time, and I fully agree with Richard, so I'm going to be very brief. I think that we do have a window for more of opportunity for more redistributional policies to confront the crisis. I think that we must, as I said before, create a cross-sectoral movement to build collective power to tackle the systemic injustice pre-crisis that has been exacerbated by the crisis. And I think that the divergences separating different movements are minor in comparison with the common challenges. So my call here is we need to work together collectively, or as Richard said, all progressive forces should be working together. We have an ecological crisis to confront. We have historical levels of inequality. We have an increase of privatization around the world. And we also have a shrinking of the democratic space. And this is also very important to tackle, because what is happening is not only we have more repression in terms of public and manifestation of freedom of expression, but it also means that at the local level, the progressive voices have been repressed. Feminist movement, trade union, all the progressive movement at the local level. Without them, we don't achieve progressive laws at the domestic level. So all of these common challenges have to be tackled together collectively to move forward. So I'm going to leave it there as a call to work together. Thank you, Hannah.
I think that Hannah has frozen again. So I'll take over very, very quickly to say thank you to Richard and to Magdalena. It has been very, very interesting and very, very multifaceted discussion. Apologies, of course, for the delay in starting to you and also to our many participants. As Hannah said, we weren't able to take many of the questions, but a lot of these questions will be the subject of discussion. And certainly the points that you raised, debt is certainly going to be a big topic of discussions on on Wednesday, where we will have a session, a strategy session, looking at some of the issues that you raised, Richard and Magdalena. We will also have a discussion specifically on development finance, looking particularly at the whole austerity and privatization discussion tomorrow. And on Thursday, particularly, do join us to look on Wednesdays, rather, do join us to look at specifically what we as Eurodad should be doing in terms of agenda strategy addressing COVID-19 going forward. There will also be a training session, because one issue that civil society has been neglecting, and Richard pointed it out today, was certainly the issue of trade, and specifically on ISDS, and what are the challenges, how has the trade community responded, and how do we need to respond as a finance community on this issue. So these are some of the issues we'll be discussing in the next few days at the Policy Forum. Do join us, and thank you again very much. First of all, to Hannah for facilitating, Richard and Magdalena for your inputs and for participation, to everybody on this call. Thank you, and have a good day and a good evening wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.